morning to all of our clients, stakeholders, partners, and social media viewers, and welcome to our first installment of our labor market podcast. I hope everyone is continuing to be safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. My name is Sebastian Quintero, and I am the Project Management Assistant at Peel Halton Workforce Development Group. As you all know, the Phase 1 release of the COVID-19 vaccination to the frontline health workers was initially implemented in Ontario on December 15th of last year. As we move on to this new year, there is frequent speculation on when future doses will be available for the general public. The initial release of the vaccine has shed some light in an otherwise bleak and dark society over the last 10 months, providing the general public with faith and encouragement that our normal lifestyles will soon return to us. However, that being said, the vaccine has also introduced some societal changes that could be seen in the foreseeable future in the workforce labor market. In today's podcast, we'll be discussing the impacts that the COVID-19 vaccine mandate could have in the workforce and the potential challenges that could arise between employers and their employees. To assist us today in the discussion, we have Joel Smith, a professional lawyer at Williams HR Law Professional Corporation, who will provide us with his professional opinion and better understanding of the possible challenges that will be faced in the workforce as the COVID-19 vaccination mandate is implemented. Joel is a lawyer with Williams HR Law, where he practices management, side labor, employment, and human rights law. He provides legal and strategic advice and training to both unionized and non-unionized employers in all areas of labor and employment law. Joel also represents employers before various courts, boards, and tribunals. Joel regularly presents before employers and human resources professionals. Joel has presented to the Human Resources Professionals Association, including at the HRPA's annual conference, annual HR summit, and annual HR law conference, as well as the Toronto Entrepreneurs Conference, the CPA Ontario Association, various chambers of commerce across Ontario, and other industry associations. Joel's writing is frequently published in labor and employment law and human resource publications, including the Canadian Employment Law Today, HR Reporter, and HR Professional magazine. So again, thanks Joel for having us here today, and thanks for all the assistance you're going to provide for us today. How are you doing?
I'm great. And thank you very much for having me, Sebastian, and appreciate both you and Peel Halton Workforce Development Group more broadly to have me on here today. I'm always happy to speak to you, whether it's through podcasts like this, through webinars and what have you. And you know, it's a hot topic we're talking about today, so I'm more than happy to discuss. And I do want to say I really appreciate the honor to be a podcast guest as you're launching this podcast, and look forward to many great episodes.
Thank you. So we do have set questions that we'll be asking today, but I just before we start, I was doing some background research on it. It really seems like we have this sort of issue between the general health of the public, like the well-being of the public health, and like the infringement on human privacy rights. It's quite interesting how the government will respond to this, because I don't know, to me it did really seem like a lot of issues are going to be implemented between the employer-employee relationship and yeah, just the general human rights privacy that could be infringed, right? So it's going to be really interesting. But nevertheless, I'm really excited to hear your input on what you have to say about all these issues that are popping up now in society. So to start off, our first question we have is: are employers allowed to require employees to get the COVID-19 vaccination?
Yeah, and you know, Sebastian, I'll answer the question. I'll tell you that's a big one, and I'll go through, you know, kind of parts of it, and I'm sure we'll find time to talk about kind of other aspects of this question, because like I say, it's a big one. You know, this is really the hottest topic that there is in labor and employment law these days. You know, as a management side labor and employment lawyer, you know, this is a question that my, you know, employer clients in unionized settings, non-unionized settings alike have been asking me frequently, and I expect will continue to ask me more and more as this vaccine becomes available, you know, more and more across the province. Obviously, right now we're in, I think, phase 1, if I'm not mistaken, and so it's still, you know, limited to very certain workplaces and individuals. But you know, over the coming months, as you say, we're hoping to see more of the vaccine available across the province to help us all get somewhere back to normal over the next little while. And so, you know, it is something that's going to continue to be really relevant and important for employers to consider. To your question, you know, can employers require employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine? I'm going to say right from the start here, and you brought a lawyer onto your podcast here, so I apologize, but I'm going to give you a lawyery answer because it really does. And the answer really is, first of all, it's not certain right now. There's not a clear answer, and second of all, it really depends. And let me be clear about what I mean by that. First of all, it's not certain in the law. Where we look to determine, what is legal, what's permitted for parties in society, in this case, employers and employees. We look to legislation, so where the government actually passes legislation, statutes that tell us what's legal and what's not. And then we look to case law. So case law being from the courts, arbitral case law arising out of the unionized workplace settings, tribunals like the Human Rights Tribunal, other boards and other legal adjudicators in our province. And right now, there's not clear law that would apply to this. There is some, there's no legislation that directly applies to this situation at all as we stand right now. You mentioned at the outset, who knows what the government might do. But at this point, I really haven't seen any indication that the government's intending to legislate, employer relationships in any broad way. But of course, the government's been rolling out new laws frequently throughout the pandemic. So we'll see. I recommend that people really rely on employers need to be moving forward as they can.
Question for you, because I know you said there's no legislation that's been passed yet for the vaccine, but I was just reading an article in the Canadian Lawyers magazine, and they were talking about how the Occupational Health and Safety Act could be a huge enforcer on the mandate, as well as it is called it's the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. In that article specifically, that Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act states that employers who fail to promote the vaccine to their employees or fail to present a healthy and safe workplace, in quotes they put COVID carelessness, will be fined $10 million. I don't know if this is something that is being proposed by the government, or if this is something that's already in place as a result of the Civil Protection Act. So do you have any inputs on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to get too deep into the legislative the legislation here, but I will just not to not to get too technical for everyone. But absolutely, I mean, the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario, it's the main source of health and safety law for provincially regulated employers in Ontario, and that's the vast majority of employers. And so that really requires, among many very specific requirements, it requires that employers take every reasonable precaution to ensure a healthy and safe workplace. What does that mean? Well, that's intentionally broad, right? And the government, the government really will look at the legislation, and they have regulations that they pass, occasionally to provide more detail about what that means in specific workplaces in specific contexts. But as of now, I don't believe that. I certainly haven't seen any, and I'm quite sure that there aren't any regulations that speak to the vaccine specifically under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So,
Okay.
When it comes to that legislation, I think what would be intended by the article, I'm not sure the exact article you're referring to, but I think what would be intended there is that, employers do have to take those reasonable precautions. And certainly there's an argument to say, at least in some workplaces, ensuring vaccination of your workforce could be the reasonable precaution that you have to take. The other legislation that you're talking about, the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, that's the legislation that they've passed, a variety of the regulations and the orders over the last few months in relation to the pandemic. So, that's where our lockdown rules have come from. And so, the government does have pretty broad authority to pass orders and that sort of thing under that legislation. I don't believe that there's anything specific right now to the vaccine in there. And we may see it. I will say it's a pretty politically controversial issue, just as it's controversial for employers. And so, I have some doubts that the government's going to get too specific about that, and employers take that heat from the public instead. But we'll see. But again, because those don't have the specific rules, because we don't have any other specific legislation, and of course there's no specific case law on this point because the vaccine is not widely available. This is all new, and we haven't seen this type of worldwide pandemic in modern times.
Yeah.
Because of that, it remains to be seen. I said also it depends. I want to speak about that for a moment because I think that's really important. It's going to depend on the context, right? It goes back to what I was just saying about the Occupational Health and Safety Act. When you talk about, what a reasonable precaution will be, that depends on those circumstances. And more broadly, employers have to look at their circumstances. So, if it is going to be reasonable to mandate vaccination in your workplace in order for an employee to be permitted to work, then you're going to have to really show that it is, there's a strong reason for that from a health and safety perspective. So, for example, employees that are working from home at all times, it's going to be a lot less reasonable to say they need to be vaccinated than, for example, a workplace dealing with vulnerable populations in the heart of the outbreak. So, I'll give you an example. Brampton has been the center of the pandemic, or one of the centers of the pandemic in Ontario for a lot of the pandemic. So, for example, a long-term care home where employees are dealing closely face-to-face with elderly, often sick residents in Brampton while the outbreak is really raging. That's going to be a lot more reasonable in that case to try to implement this type of policy than the other situation that I was talking about.
Interesting. Yeah, because that was one of our questions before that we've prepared for you was like, is there a line or a boundary to be drawn between people that are obviously necessarily they need to have the vaccine, and then others where, like you said, they work from home majority of the time, they're not involved or interacting with vulnerable populations, so it's probably less likely for them to require it. But nevertheless, even outside of work, it would still be beneficial for them to eventually just get it. I guess it's hard right now because it's a new vaccine and people are still hesitant. Like myself, I'm a little hesitant as well, but I don't even know when I'd be able to get it. I think it would be in like sometime in July or maybe the late summer, based on the track and the doses that are currently available anyway. But I know a lot of people that are skeptical, and people that have had it and still feel a little hesitant on if they made the right decision or not.
Yep.
But I guess that's just the way everyone reacts with a new vaccine, right? Like you're injecting something, a medication into your body that, yes, scientists have say 95% work rate, and there's still that 5% inefficient.
Yeah.
But I guess it's
my knowledge. Sorry, go ahead, Sebastian.
No. I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a while before people are going to start to become more confident in the vaccine. And I guess it's more, I know there's like the test dummies that are already sort of taken it. So everyone kind of wants to see and hold off until how they respond to it. But at the same time, the human anatomy is such a complex organism, right? So everyone's going to react differently to the vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what we've seen so far. You see the occasional, case in the media where somebody reacted differently than is expected, and of course that gets people's anxieties up. But to what you were saying there, it really does, depend on when the vaccine's available. That's the biggest point of the context that I was talking about before. If an employee can't get the vaccine, of course, as an employer, you can't mandate them to do so. If it's not available to them, what are you going to do? Right. And so, this question for some workplaces is relevant. I have some clients in the healthcare and elder care industries where the vaccine is more available for them because they're part of that phase 1. And so this is a decision for them to make right now. For most employers, though, it's a decision to really be looking to the future for. That doesn't mean employers shouldn't be, considering and communicating to their employees what they're thinking right now, because transparency is going to be key given the anxieties you're talking about. But these types of rules can't be implemented until that vaccine is available for individuals, if it will be reasonable in the end to actually do so.
Yeah. So that being said, so if a situation were to arise in which the employee refuses to take the vaccine, what are the employer's imposable responses to this refusal after the fact?
Yeah, and what employers can do in response to an employee's refusal. Again, I'm going to apologize for being the lawyer. It's going to depend on those circumstances, right? I think there's going to be a spectrum for what the options will be. The first thing to consider is, can employers actually, we talk about mandatory vaccination, and that's the way we've been talking about it here, and how I'm, more generally talking about it with clients. But usually I think people aren't really intending to say, mandatory vaccination. You as an employee must go and get this vaccine. It's more in most cases, mandatory vaccination in order to continue to work in the way that you normally do. Because there's one thing to require drug testing, and there's certainly a lot of law mandating drug testing in certain workplaces. That's a different level of intrusion into someone's bodily integrity than actually requiring them to receive a vaccine. And you were talking about what the scientists have said. I'll tell you, I'm not a scientist. I can't say with certainty. I don't know I know how effective it will be. I don't know, side effects. I won't pretend that I will know. But all we really know at this stage is that it's a decision that people need to make, and they're concerned, right? And so to require somebody to actually have the vaccine without an alternative is likely to be an uphill battle at minimum for employers. So usually we're going to be looking more at a spectrum of what the responses truly will be, coming from changing the way that an employee works so that you can ensure their safety and the safety of others in the workplace. For example, work from home is a great example. Again, if an employee is not working from home but they can, even after in Ontario we're allowed to go back to the workplace
Right.
again. At that point, it may be, if the employee is able to work from home, a solution maybe that they keep working from home for the time being until the pandemic has died down to some extent and it's safer for them to come back without being vaccinated. The other end of the spectrum really is going to be termination for just cause, right? Letting the employee go permanently without any notice, without any pay in lieu of that notice. That's the more severe end of the spectrum. And again, to the extent that it's going to be reasonable to mandate vaccination, and again, it's that question is not absolutely clear at this point. But if you are going to go to that far end of the spectrum, it's much more likely to be considered reasonable in those circumstances where where the vaccine is more necessary. Again, I'm talking about the centers of the outbreak, when the pandemic is really severe, when there's a lot of cases in the province, when there's a lot of cases in the specific community of the workplace, and where the work that the employee is doing is more dangerous. That's the type of situation where you can go to that more severe end of the spectrum. And of course, there's going to be all sorts of different options in the middle of that spectrum between those two extremes.
So I know we talk about the infringements of human privacy rights. Is there any specific rights that are exceptions for the employee in this situation? Because like you said, you get to the point where, yeah, you work in a setting with a lot of vulnerable people, like healthcare and retirement living and home support workers, for example. Like it just seems it's subjective again, because like I said, the human body is so complex, and not every one person is going to react to the vaccine in a consistent way. So like, how do you draw the line there? Like, what if you have an employee that works in a vulnerable population, but they have many, I wouldn't say many, they have one or two like compromisable medical conditions that could be affected as a result of taking the vaccine? What would you think would be the employer's obligation at that point to do?
Yeah, that's a huge component of what employers need to consider when they're thinking about these types of policies. Even if you're in a workplace where it's considered reasonable more broadly to mandate vaccination to continue to be at work, or whatever the alternative might be, employers still have to consider human rights. You always have to consider human rights as an employer, in Ontario and across the country. In Canada, human rights is considered to be at the top end of individuals' rights, and it always has to be considered. There are 16 protected grounds under our human rights code in Ontario. And those are all characteristics where, if an employee has a certain personal characteristic that fits within those grounds, that causes the employee to be unable to meet the expectations of the role. And in the scenario we're talking about, the expectation may be become vaccinated against COVID-19. If they have a protected ground that causes them to be unable to do so, the employer has a duty to accommodate. So that's the standard, that's the hallmark of the human rights regime here in Ontario and across the country. Employers have to accommodate those protected grounds. So when it comes to the COVID vaccine, I think we're really talking about two protected grounds primarily. The one you just mentioned, it's disability. That's what it's called under the Human Rights Code. If an employee has some sort of disability that renders them unable to get the vaccine, or at much greater risk if they were to get the vaccine for whatever reason, then employers are going to have to accommodate that restriction that the employee has. They're not going to be able to hold them to the same standard as the others, because that would violate the Human Rights Code. What the accommodation would look like, now that's going to be contextual, just like everything else we're talking about. It's always about context in these types of issues, and health and safety issues, human rights issues, et cetera. And so when we're talking about a disability and accommodating that, it may be that the employee has to stay home for a period of time, but it also may be that the employer makes some arrangements, provides some sort of systems so the employee can work at a different location or at home while, again, the pandemic is raging. The other protected ground that I think is really important to keep in mind is religion. There are certain religions that do not permit their adherents to become vaccinated against really anything. And I'm not going to say I'm a religious expert. I know that there are some religions that do restrict that. And so if that's the case, if an employee has a legitimately held belief in a religion that doesn't permit them to become vaccinated, it's the same thing as I was just saying with disability. Employers have to accommodate that restriction because that's a legitimate restriction that's protected in our human rights law. And so again, what the accommodation looks like, it's contextual. It always depends on the circumstances, but there must be some sort of accommodation. You can't just have this blanket rule apply to somebody who has some sort of personal characteristic under the human rights code that doesn't allow them to get that vaccine.
It must seem counterintuitive though when you think about it, because it's in this situation, if we're looking at an employee that is compromisable against the vaccine but works in a vulnerable population, it's almost like we're battling against two different acts. Like we got the employer side with the health and safety, the occupational health and safety, not for the employee that's compromisable, but for the external population that's interacting with that employee. And then at the same time, we have to accommodate for that employee based on their human rights regulations, right? So it's just it's just such a, it's like a, I don't know, it's such a can of worms, because it's like you can't go one, or you can't really go one or the other, because it's like it's either the best for the employee or the best for the general public. And the only thing, like you said, I think that the way that the employer could accommodate is maybe, I don't know, have them quarantine for like, maybe, I don't know, maybe have them quarantine 2 weeks at home if they're showing any symptoms, or have them regularly
which
tested.
is the requirement right now anyway. And I don't think that requirement's going to go away anytime soon.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, at this point in time, the employer does have authority to excuse the individual from the employment without cause, correct? If they refuse to take the vaccine and they don't have a compromisable or religious or disability defect to the vaccine?
I would say not necessarily. My view, and again, that goes back to the context that we were talking about, what are the circumstances of how high is the risk? In my view, there will be some circumstances where that's likely going to be something the employer can do. And that's, dismissal without cause falls on that spectrum I was talking about of the potential responses an employer can have. But it will depend. I think in many cases that'll be something an employer can do. But again, you have to look at the circumstances of the workplace of the employee in question, and really ensure that it's something that you're permitted to do. Whether that's absolutely going to be allowed or not, we're going to see over the coming months and years as case law comes out where employers have done this and employees are challenging it. That's how we're going to find those real answers.
So, if you came across a situation, just moving on from that last question. Do you think employees could present a case on the infringement of human privacy rights against their employer in a court of law?
Yeah, so privacy law is going to be, the big thing that we have in mind here, right? We're talking about, people's bodily integrity, their own privacy, when we're talking about whether they need to be vaccinated. An important thing to keep in mind in Ontario specifically, for provincially regulated employees, again, that's most employers in Ontario will be provincially regulated workplaces. There is no legislation that specifically addresses employer-employee relationships and employers' ability to infringe upon an employee's privacy when it comes to the workplace. The Ontario government is working on legislation right now, and there's legislation in certain other provinces in the country, but right now we don't have that. So there is a big gap in Ontario when it comes to privacy law. And so it would be more challenging for employees in Ontario than certain other provinces to bring these types of privacy law challenges against a mandatory vaccination policy, but there certainly can be some circumstances where that would be permitted. There are other legal avenues where employees do have privacy rights. There are something called torts, which are types of actions that employees can bring in the courts in the common law that relate to their privacy that they may have the opportunity to go and come after their employer for. But it's, again, always going to depend on those circumstances.
Right. So another actually interesting thing that got me thinking in one of the articles I read was the distinction between the unionized and the non-unionized environments. And that's interesting because the unionized environments are very protective on their employees, but there's definitely more benefits of working in a unionized environment, and definitely somewhat more attractive for a job seeker to try to find a union occupation as opposed to a non-union. So in one of the articles, Christopher Monroe, he's another employment and labor law lawyer, and
Mhm.
he was making a suggestion based on his professional opinion that as a result of the mandate, or the mandate that could or will be issued on based on the COVID vaccination, he expects to be a distinction between unionized and non-unionized environments, whereby the vaccine will be more easily imposed on non-unionized occupations. So I want to just ask you, Joel, like, do you agree with this statement, or do you have any input on how this is going to turn out between these two environments?
Absolutely, I would agree with that. I think that's accurate. Unionized workplaces and non-unionized workplaces are governed differently in Ontario and again across the country in Canada. Unionized workplaces, there's specific legislation that governs unionized workplaces, but more importantly, in a case like this, there's the case law that sets out the law that applies to unionized workplaces. That comes from arbitral case law, which is a bit different than civil law from our courts that applies to non-unionized workplaces. And on top of that, the really big piece, and this goes to what you were just saying, unionized workplaces have a collective agreement that has a big set of protections that are generally much more protective of the employees in the unionized workplace than a non-unionized employee's employment contract, for example. The big one that people will typically think about is the protection against dismissal, unless it's a legitimate restructuring decision or unless there is just cause for the dismissal. That without cause termination concept in the non-unionized sector, that doesn't apply in unionized workplaces. That's a huge protection that we're talking about, but there are others as well. And so in unionized workplaces, the law has developed, the law that applies to those workplaces is generally developed to say that, if an employer, wants to implement a policy, for example, a health and safety policy mandating vaccination, like we're talking about here, it needs to be both necessary and reasonable. And, what our adjudicators, what the arbitrators, and ultimately the courts, if there's an appeal, will look at is, we need to compare, on the one hand, the employee's rights that are being infringed, and on the other hand, the importance of whatever the restriction that the employer is trying to put in place is. And so in this case, the importance of the vaccine to workplace and societal health and safety compared to the employee's rights to make decisions about whether or not to be vaccinated. And so that test is a unionized specific test that really needs to be considered, and that's going to generally create a higher threshold for unionized workplaces and employers to face when they're considering implementing these policies. The other side of the coin as well, I think that's really important on a non-unionized workplace. Non-unionized employees don't have that union overseeing and looking out for their interests day to day. But on top of that, you are allowed as an employer, and it generally happens that the employer and an individual employee will have a one-on-one employment contract. That's the non-union version of the collective agreement that we're talking about between the union on behalf of all employees and the employer in unionized settings. Because the employer and the employee can come to those direct agreements, one option for employers in the non-unionized sectors is, if they're looking to hire people right now, they may put a condition right in that employment contract, we'll hire you, but as soon as the vaccine's available, you're required to take the vaccine. That's something you have to agree to as a condition of taking this job. That's much more likely to be, legally defensible than implementing that to an employee who's already working.
Right.
And so that's something employers have that opportunity to do, which they don't have in the unionized workplace setting, because those agreements have to be with the union as a whole, and they only come, once every few years when the collective agreement is up again for negotiation.
So what about, so I know you say that, I agree with you. I think that'll be part of the job posting now, if once the mandate comes out, that if they will or will not require you to take the vaccine coming into the job position. But what about the people that already work in the non-union positions at that company? What if they, like, do you see some sort of infringement on equal rights at this point? Because you have a new employee coming in, and they're sort of given an ultimatum whether they want to get the vaccine or not, and obviously it's going to affect their job security at that point. But then you have employee B that's been working at this company for an X amount of years, and now they have no choice. So you're giving one a choice and one not a choice, but then at the same time, one is employed and the other is not employed yet. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's not really any law that protects, those who have a job already compared to those who don't, or vice versa. The type of legislation we'd be talking about would be anti-discrimination legislation, and that really in Ontario is human rights code. And whether you are currently employed is not a human right that we have. It's not one of the protected grounds that I was talking about before. So from that perspective, there wouldn't be a significant difference, and I don't think that those new employees are going to have a particular protection from that perspective. But certainly, it will be easier for the employer to try to implement that with those new employees for that reason. That doesn't mean that non-unionized workplaces can't also implement these types of changes. Excuse me for the phone in
No,
the
no, not at
background.
all.
Joys of working from home. So they are still able to implement policies in the workplace, and the extent to which they can do so again are going to depend on how important is this from a health and safety perspective on the one hand, and on the other hand, leaving aside the health and safety perspective, what rights has the employer protected in order to roll out new policies in the workplace? Is there a handbook that the employee has already signed saying the employee can roll out new policies, as they see fit, as they need to day to day? These types of things will have to be considered.
Okay, awesome. I know we're almost a half an hour in, I think. I don't want to keep it too much longer, but I mean, these have all been fantastic opinions and answers that you've given us. Again, I think just looking at the bigger picture, like no one really knows what's going to happen in the foreseeable future. Of course, everything is speculation. Not saying everything I'm reading in any articles are legitimate and they're all set in stone, because no one knows, right? Again, like you said, we're still in phase one. There's still a specific number of people that can get the vaccine, and there's still time for the government to purchase more, because I think we don't even have. I think we ran out right now. I don't even think we have enough right now.
Right. Certainly, we certainly don't have enough for the whole country at this
No.
point.
So it is interesting. I mean, I always take every day with a grain of salt. It's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen, but it's always interesting to talk about. I guess all you can do is just stay safe and hope for the best, I guess.
I agree. I mean, it's, employers just need to be, looking out, taking all the other health and safety precautions
Yeah.
that they've been taking to this point, PPE, sanitizing, social distancing, and all the other things that specific workplaces have needed to implement based on their specific context. Keep on doing that. And of course, employers need to think about, what their policy will be when the vaccine becomes available, because it does, I'm confident that it's a question of when, not if, the vaccine will become available for everyone.
Right.
And then this is a decision employers will have to contend with. In the meantime, employees are wondering, right? This is why we're talking about this now. This is why so many people are thinking about this question, because it's on everyone's minds. People are anxious about it and want to know. And so, what employers should be doing, even before the vaccine is available for their employees is, first of all, of course, considering what they will do, but also communicating to their employees to the extent that they can in the meantime. Most employers, in my view, really all employers, in my view, should be strongly encouraging at minimum their employees to become vaccinated once it's available to them, because that's, a big step that you can take to try to protect that health and safety and to meet those health and safety obligations that employers broadly have that we were talking about.
Right. And honestly, just looking now, I mean, like I've been working from home the past year, and I know my family members have been working from home the past year. And to be honest with you, I think this pandemic, as bad as it was, it's definitely brought a different side of lifestyles for some people. Like I could see a significantly less amount of people in the future working in the office, because now everyone's, I mean, we've had all this technology for a long time, and obviously it's getting better and better, and we're able to work more remotely a lot easier now. I Part of me just feels a lot of the employees, if they had the choice, if they were able to take the vaccine or just work from home and not take the vaccine, I'm sure a lot of them would just not take the vaccine and stay from home. If that's one way,
Absolutely.
if that's one way for them, like we said before, if you work from home, depending on the environment you're working in, you probably wouldn't even have to take it if you didn't want to, right?
Yeah, and if that's the alternative for employees, I think you're right. I think many employees would take it, especially if you have any concerns at all about the vaccine, and that certainly has to be part of what employers are thinking about when they're communicating to their employees. Are you making that an option? Because if you are, you can expect a lot of employees will take it. You can also expect some employees who want to get the vaccine but want to work from home more. They may
Right.
say, okay, well, if that's a choice that I have, okay, I'm not getting vaccinated, and they may just tell you dishonestly that they're not getting vaccinated in the interest of working from home. So employers really need to consider, what the alternatives are that they're putting on the table, or if they are putting alternatives on the table when they're rolling these types of policies out, because there can be those really significant side effects that you're talking about from an employer perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Joel. We appreciate all your help here and appreciate you coming on today. I've learned a lot more, definitely. and I know all our viewers will as well. And hopefully we can do this again in the future. Hopefully not
Thanks
talk
so
about
much for having
COVID though.
me. Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we'll have
So
other things to talk
anything else but COVID, well, we can talk about.
about.
Thanks again,
All right.
Joel, and I hope you have a great day and stay healthy and safe out there.
Same to you. All the best, Sebastian.
Have
Thanks.
a good one.